I got a lot to read, so I'm gonna read fast so we got some time to talk. The roots of the contemporary ecological crisis are deeply embedded in the history and development of racial monopoly capitalism. The arrival, conquest, and settlement of Europeans in North America, as well as the genocide and subjugation of indigenous peoples fundamental to that process, relied in part on an ideology and practice of subjugating and exploiting the natural world itself. As Europeans colonized North America and established racial capitalism, they viewed the, quote, natural resources as endless potential commodities to be used together with exploited human labor to generate profit. This logic led to extreme violence in many forms. Workers considered disposable in the quest for profit had few protections from the dangers of extractive industries. The endless hunt for more natural resources fueled and still fuels war, imperialist expansion, and colonization, resulting in devastating ecological and human consequences beyond the extraction itself. One key form of violence often used to enable resource expropriation was and continues to be the use of military or paramilitary forces to assassinate environmental defenders. Not only capitalism, but socialist governments have also allowed for the same extractivism and, quote, growth at all costs principles that have put capitalist development in contradiction with the Earth's natural limits. This proved true for many 20th century socialist experiments, especially in the Soviet bloc, often with destructive long-term environmental outcomes comparable to its capitalist analog. In the global South, socialist and social democratic experiments confronted with abysmal living conditions after decades or centuries of colonial underdevelopment have too often relied on extractivism to generate the wealth needed to improve those conditions and foster, quote, development. This contradiction has led eco-socialists to pose the critical question: how can revolution be reconceived not as unleashing the productive forces of the working class, but as, quote, pulling the emergency brake on the locomotive of industrial growth and development? How to develop our productive forces with ecological balance while still meeting the material needs of all people is the key question that we face going forward into the future. Today, the climate justice left and our vision for ecological justice is directly linked to the strong resistance and innovative thinking of the environmental justice movement in the United States, social movements from across the global South, and indigenous people's struggles. In contrast to the mainstream Euro-American environmental movement, these movements have explicitly linked protection and stewardship of the earth to structural economic and racial injustice, as well as to anti-colonialist politics and demands for indigenous sovereignty. Today's U.S. climate justice movement is rooted in the environmental justice movement, which has many overlaps with, but is not the same as the climate justice left. The environmental justice movement emerged in the 1980s in response to the severe impacts of environmental racism, particularly the disproportionate pollution in low-income communities and communities of color. Led by Black, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, and indigenous communities, the environmental justice movement has articulated the connections between race, class, and pollution, and has redefined the, quote, environment to include where people live, work, play, and pray. Many of the early environmental justice organizers came directly out of the racial, economic justice and national liberation movements of the 1970s, including the American Indian movement, Asian working class movements, Chicano movements in the Southwest, and Black liberation struggles in the South. Many of these organizers are still active in the environmental justice and climate justice movement, providing unique political leadership. At the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991, environmental justice activists came together and developed the Environmental Justice Principles, a counter-hegemonic platform that explicitly indicts several core principles of extractive capitalism. Among other things, it calls for, quote, the economic alternatives which would contribute to the development of environmentally safe livelihoods, and the, quote, political, economic, and cultural liberation that we have been denied for over 500 years of colonization and oppression, resulting in the poisoning of our communities and land and the genocide of our people. This holistic understanding of the environment and root causes of environmental justice was in direct contrast to the mainstream environmental movement. Products related to extraction are woven into nearly every aspect of our lives, from the food we eat to the transport and energy we use. We use the term extractive sector to refer to corporations that directly extract fossil fuels, such as oil and gas companies, as well as those that are reliant on fossil fuel products, such as industrial agriculture, which can also be considered extractive in other ways. This vast web of ecologically destructive industries and the ruling class that controls them maintain a strong grip on our political, economic, and social systems. They've created and maintain a broad hegemonic understanding that we, quote, need fossil fuels, that the alternatives are unrealistic, and or that our overall growth and consumption-oriented economic model is indefinitely sustainable. The extractive sector has an extremely high level of access to and infiltration of the political system, concentrated on the right, but including many centrists and liberals as well. These industries and their front groups are active at every political level, killing or weakening climate initiatives and policy at local, state, national, and international levels. They exercise strong control over and access to the means of communication, including direct ownership and influence over major television, print, and talk radio outlets. Extractive companies and the ruling class who controls them are supported by a network of conservative think tanks and funders who actively promote climate change denial and explicitly work to undermine climate science. While the climate justice left recognizes that capitalism is the fundamental driver of climate change, the broader U.S. climate movement is dominated by, quote, mainstream forces that don't necessarily recognize this root cause. The mainstream climate movement has historically been predominantly white and middle class and has both refused to address and directly perpetuated structural racial and economic injustice. While different mainstream actors have particular interests, they share a belief that the climate crisis can be averted while maintaining this neoliberal global capitalist system. The mainstream climate movement has promoted policies that narrowly focus on counting and trying to reduce carbon dioxide parts per million on a global scale and addressing the, quote, impacts of climate change. Not only has this approach been generally ineffective, global emissions have reached record highs. It has also failed to address the disproportionate burden of impacts on frontline communities. Focusing on the aggregate amount of carbon dioxide at the state, national, or international level overlooks already existing or increasing levels of concentrated pollution in communities of color and does not repair this harm or prevent further localized damage. We need to build a united front between the left, climate justice left, and the mainstream climate justice movement, and we have to extend out way beyond where we are right now to bring many more people into this struggle. Most significantly, we face a stark incongruence between the short time frame for addressing the climate crisis and a longer time frame to assemble forces necessary for large-scale revolutionary change. Achieving our full vision for ecological justice will take decades or longer, but the latest scientific projections give us just 10 years to halve all global greenhouse gas emissions and prevent the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. We lack a clear understanding of what strategies will help accomplish the two distinct goals of building our power for long-term change and addressing the immediacy of the climate crisis. Without a strategic framework, we have no basis to assess the type of short-term tactical alliances we might need. We do not have alignment around whether or not compromises on mitigation measures will be necessary to address the most immediate impacts of the climate crisis, or what, if any, reforms would advance our cause. Our responsibilities as internationalists within the U.S. present other challenges. A just solution to the global climate crisis requires not only an environmental transformation of our economy, but also a substantial reduction in resource consumption by the United States. How do we build a united front around a platform that combines radical environmental transformation of our economy, radical redistribution of wealth and economic power, and an overall contraction of our existing growth-centered national economy? How do we ensure that as we contract our economy, as we start to consume less, that it does not harm those in the U.S. who are already struggling to make ends meet? I really think this is the hardest question for us. We're in the belly of the beast, and we're all privileged. We're privileged because of oppression of folks all over the world, of the theft of the resources from all over the world. So we're going to be faced with the fact of arguing and fighting with our family members when we are required to live with less. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. We have to live with less. The world has to live with less, and particularly those of us in the belly in the United States who have so much more than so many other folks in the world. But I think that's really the hardest contradiction for us, is some of our families will be down there helping to build that wall even bigger, like Fred was saying, to try to keep other people from getting these privileges that we have. And so this climate barbarism that the book talked about, it's not just Trump. Some of our families may be barbaric as well. So that's the kind of struggle that we really need to have all around, because we really have to change a mindset. We know there's an emergency. A whole lot of people don't, but when they figure out there's an emergency, the question of when you face an emergency, what you going to do?